Today we're going to talk about something really important, trauma. Supporting kids who've been through trauma at church starts by learning more about it. We're so glad you're here today. Hey, what's wrong? Oh, you had a student who had a really bad day today? He's one of your kids who has a tough home life? And your heart breaks for him, but you just don't always understand him? When kids deal with too much trauma, everything can feel hard, including knowing how to help them at church. But one thing that always helps is learning more. Join us as we take a deeper look at supporting kids at church, understanding trauma. So what should we know about trauma? Well, how about start with what trauma is? Trauma is the response to a distressing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. Often we think of it like this, the big stuff. Things like accidents, disasters, violence, danger, or even losing a loved one. These are the things that most of us agree are really traumatic, even if they only happen once. This is called acute trauma. But what about the other things in life? The stuff that isn't a one-time big event. Things like financial, housing, or food insecurity. Living with someone who has a poorly managed mental health condition or addiction. Bullying. Emotional abuse or neglect, or even having repeated medical procedures. This is trauma too. When someone is exposed to prolonged or repeated distress of any kind, it can cause what is called chronic trauma. And while chronic trauma may not be as obvious, it's just as harmful. And here's another thing you should know. Just because a person is away from the trauma doesn't mean that the impact of it is gone. This means that kids who have been removed from a stressful environment are now in a loving home are still working through healing and still need extra support and understanding. And so do their families. And did you know this? Even if people experience trauma when they were too young to remember it, the impact of that trauma is still there. This is called implicit trauma. So what do all these different types of trauma mean for you at church? Well, it means this. Trauma, even in childhood, may be more common than you think. So common, in fact, that if you are serving in children's ministry, then you are already serving children who have been through some really, really hard things, which is why it's so important to keep learning more, like learning what trauma might look like at church. It can impact the way a student behaves or responds to things, and often we mistake these behaviors as a student just being defiant, when really what these behaviors tell us is that a student is struggling inside. So what might it look like in a church classroom? Well, here's some things that you might see. Overreacting, hypervigilance, trouble focusing, anxiousness, anger, defiance, bossiness, or defensiveness, sadness, avoidance or withdrawal, not forming attachments, or oversharing. It can even look like physical ailments, regression, and more. But there's something else to note about this too. A lot of these behaviors are also common with other things, like ADHD, autism spectrum, and more. So if a student is exhibiting some of these signs, don't assume that it's trauma. It might be something else. The truth is, when we serve students at church, we may never know everything that's going on in their lives, but what we do know is that while we're with them, we have the chance to show them the love of Christ. So why does trauma cause these responses? Well, there's many reasons, but a few common ones include these. Sometimes a child may still be using coping mechanisms that worked while he was in the traumatic environment but are not helpful now. For example, if a child grew up in an unsafe home, being hypervigilant may have protected him from danger, but when he continues being hypervigilant in a safe environment, like your church classroom, it's no longer helpful. It is actually harder. Other times, children may not have the proper adult support to process through trauma in a healthy way, and the trauma just feels too big to face until they're ready. When this happens, sometimes kids get stuck. This can result in feeling perpetually numb, angry, or sad. Sometimes it even results in PTSD. And sometimes there will be things that may trigger feelings associated with past trauma. This can cause a fight, flight, and freeze response. So how should we respond? If you see that a student is struggling, remember that your body language will help set the tone for what happens next. Kids who are dealing with trauma need to feel safe and cared for. So communicate this by using a calm, warm tone of voice and open body language. Then meet the student where he is. What that looks like will be different depending on the situation. He'll be talking about boundaries, being a good listener, or just being a safe presence in the room. Each situation is different, so use your best judgment, but always start with empathy. Well, I think we learned a lot about trauma today, but there's one more thing before you go. Remember that serving kids who have been through hard things isn't always easy, but it does always matter. And don't forget this: trauma can leave an impact on a child, but so does love. We hope that today's video gave you a little bit better understanding about trauma, and we hope you'll join us next time as we take a deeper look on how to support kids who've been through trauma in the church classroom. See you next time.